Good morning. Hope everybody had a nice evening and good conversations last night. It's great to have you here again. I'm Matthew Spalding, Associate Vice President Dean for Hillsdale here in Washington, D.C. I don't know about you, but I did my normal routine this morning and read the papers, and it's getting harder and harder to keep up with things in this town as it goes sometimes increasingly crazy, and some things are going very well. What I find interesting is when you step back and think about the last campaign and this presidency and its kind of disruption of elite opinion, it actually reveals things in many ways almost more than what it actually is doing. It's kind of like it pulls back the curtain. And that's really clear on the left. The other day I was reading the New York Times, doing a little opposition research. And the guest editorial, not the columnist, but a guest editorial for the New York Times was writing about how the main social aim right now must be a formal restructuring of the American constitutional system. And this guest editorialist was the editor of the Jacobin, which is a socialist newspaper. All you have to do is look no further than the Kavanaugh hearings to see that Alinsky's rules for radicals seems to be driving their cause. Things are also revealed on the right as well, pulling back that curtain, about their thinking and the coherence of conservatism, how they acted and adjusted in these circumstances. Is this a breath of fresh air, or is this Macbeth? How do we think about this? But of course, this is not necessarily a new question. These are actually old questions. What are the first principles of our political thinking? What are the grounds of that thinking, and how do they guide us in new and different times? Both of our panels this morning deal and address that kind of a question, stepping back and thinking through what's going on in different areas. Our first panel this morning is being chaired by a friend and colleague of mine at the college, Ronald Pistrito. But let me preface it by saying that the Van Andel School of Statesmanship has accomplished an amazing and great and significant thing for our country, largely because of him. He's the driving force behind it. They recently graduated their first PhDs. And if you understand the importance of ideas in shaping how we think about our future, you realize that's extremely significant. He's the dean of the Graduate School of Statesmanship at Hillsdale College and holds the Charles and Lucia Shipley Chair in American Constitutionalism. He's also a great scholar, especially of the progressive era, and has written Woodrow Wilson and the Roots of American Liberalism, and has edited a collection of his writings, Woodrow Wilson, The Essential Political Writings. I give you R.J. Pistrito. All yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Good morning, everybody. It's our first panel, today's program, and the topic of the panel this morning is libertarianism and its relevance in politics today. So on the one hand, libertarianism certainly doesn't seem to poll very highly in American politics. Candidates identifying themselves as libertarians aren't winning office in any great number. On the other hand, I think one could argue that the statism that we saw in the Obama years has kind of pushed Republican politics in a libertarian direction. This has also had an effect on the conservative legal philosophy. As many on the right, we now see them calling for a much more activist judiciary than, say, one could have predicted 10 or 20 years ago. So this is an interesting question. We have three very distinguished panelists to engage on the question. I will introduce each panelist when it is his turn to speak. We're going to begin with Randy Barnett. Professor Barnett is the Carmack Waterhouse Professor of Legal Theory at the Georgetown University Law Center. He teaches constitutional law and contracts there. He's also the director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution. Mr. Barnett's most recent book is titled Our Republican Constitution, Securing the Liberty and Sovereignty of We the People. 2004, he argued the medical marijuana case of Gonzalez v. Raich before the Supreme Court. And in 2012, he was one of the lawyers representing the NFIB in its constitutional challenge to the Affordable Care Act. Welcome, Randy Barnett.
Well, thank you, RJ. It's a great pleasure to speak again at Hillsdale College's Constitution Day celebration, as well as to share the program not only with RJ Pistrito, whose work I greatly admire, but with F.H. Buckley and R.R. Reno, although it makes me think that I should start calling myself R.E. Barnett from now on. This must be some secret cabal code that was not shared with me. I'm just using my actual surname. It's very radical. I'm the radical on the program. As our topic this morning is libertarianism politically relevant, which may strike you as an odd topic for a Constitution Day program, but I'm going to roll with it because that's what I was invited to talk about. As the only libertarian on the panel, I think that's safe to say, it falls to me to define libertarianism for our discussion, which I believe I can do in two sentences. So the first sentence is this: all men are created equal and are endowed with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The second sentence is this: that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That, my friends, is libertarianism in a nutshell. Of course, it also happens to be the words of the Declaration of Independence. Now, I don't need to remind a Hillsdale College gathering that the Constitution is not our founding document. The Declaration is. The Declaration officially identified the political theory on which the United States was founded. I stress officially because this theory was drafted by a committee, edited by the Congress as a whole, and unanimously adopted by representatives of the 13 states. It was the official theory of why the colonists were justified in separating from and resuming a state of nature with Great Britain. It was only after this official act that what the Declaration refers to as a form of government was then established, first by the Articles of Confederation and later by the Constitution. And these two constitutional structures were adopted as means to the end of government identified by the Declaration. And the end is the protection of the natural rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, although I myself prefer the canonical formulation of natural rights that was drafted by George Mason for the Virginia Declaration of Rights. It read, all men are born equally free and independent and have certain inherent natural rights of which they cannot, by any compact, deprive or divest their posterity, among which are the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety. Mason's canonical formulation of natural rights was included in the constitutions of 5 states. Jefferson's version was adopted only by New York. Nor was this language merely hortatory and unenforceable. Mason's formulation in the Massachusetts Constitution was used by its Supreme Court to hold that slavery was unconstitutional in that state. Mason's formulation was also the core of Justice Bushrod Washington's influential circuit court opinion in Corfield versus Coryell, explaining the meaning of privileges and immunities that are protected by Article 4. Washington's definition of privileges and immunities was, in turn, heavily relied upon by congressional Republicans in the 39th Congress to explain the meaning of privileges or immunities as it appears in the 14th Amendment. Notice that the rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, to which the Declaration refers, and the natural rights to the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, to which Mason's Declaration refers, are all individual or personal rights. They are not collective or communitarian rights. And the purpose of government, the only purpose of government on this account, is to secure these personal rights. The Declaration says nothing about enforcing a code of personal ethics or morality, enforcing the rights of the community, or enforcing a right of a political majority to impose its will on a dissenting minority. It speaks only of securing what the Ninth Amendment refers to as, quote, the rights retained by the people. The Declaration also affirms that governments are not to be confused with the people themselves. Governments are instituted amongst us. Governments are not us. And indeed, the Declaration expressly distinguishes between the government and the governed. When the Declaration speaks of the consent of the governed, it is speaking of the people of the United States consenting to be governed by Great Britain or by a government of the United States. It is not claiming that a majority of some subset of the people who are designated legislators can consent to laws that then violate the fundamental rights of the sovereign people on whom those laws are imposed. Rather, it says that governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed. According to this passage, legitimate governments may exercise not all powers, not unlimited powers, but only their just powers. A just power is one within the competence of a legitimate government, which the Declaration defines as one that secures the natural and inalienable rights of we the people, each and every one of us. Now, some of you may have noticed that I omitted the words "by their creator" when I quoted the Declaration, but do not be dismayed. I did this only because my purpose was to define libertarianism, and because libertarianism is a political theory. As a political theory, libertarianism takes no particular stance on whether these inalienable natural rights are endowed by a supreme being or are instead simply the essential prerequisite of successfully achieving a society in which individuals may pursue their own happiness while living in close proximity to, that is, in society with, others who also have inalienable natural rights. Libertarians who believe in natural rights do not all agree on the justifications for those rights. Which brings me to an important caveat. Rightly understood, libertarianism is a political theory, not a moral theory. Morality instructs us on how each of us ought to act, and libertarianism is not a theory about that. Libertarianism is a political theory of governance, and it claims that government exists to protect individual rights and must be structured in such a way as not to violate the very rights it has been empowered to protect. But although the protection of natural rights, the natural rights of we the people from foreign and domestic threats, is the ultimate end of government, as I explained in my book, The Structure of Liberty, Justice, and the Rule of Law, these rights are themselves merely means to the higher end of enabling each person to pursue happiness while living in society with others. As an Aristotelian natural law adherent myself, I think natural law ethics tells us how to exercise the bounded individual liberty that is defined and protected by natural rights. So while libertarianism makes no claim about how people should exercise the freedom that is defined by their natural rights, what libertarianism does claim is that first come rights and then comes government. The Declaration of Independence shows this to be the officially adopted American theory of government. As I have now defined libertarianism, then, the question before us is this: is the American theory of government politically relevant today? I think we can all agree that the American theory of government has been in trouble for a very long time. Were this not the case, Hillsdale College would not be the distinctive place that it is. Slavery was a great departure from the American theory of government before the Civil War. Jim Crow was a great departure for 100 years afterwards. The rise of progressivism as a political movement in the late 19th century led to many more departures. The Supreme Court has not covered itself in glory in adhering to the American theory of government. It aided slavery before the Civil War in cases like Prigg versus Pennsylvania and Dred Scott versus Sanford. It abetted Jim Crow by gutting the 14th Amendment in cases like the Slaughterhouse cases and U.S. v. Cruikshank. And after an initial resistance, it acquiesced to a progressive vision of government beginning in the 1920s and proceeding up to today. To the extent that restoring the lost Constitution, the title of another of my books, by nominating judges who adhere to the original meaning of the text is politically relevant today, then so too is the American theory of government that comprises the core of libertarianism. And I believe we can all be heartened by the fact that this administration, unlike its Democratic and Republican predecessors, is making the appointment of originalist justices a priority. If Judge Kavanaugh becomes Justice Kavanaugh, a majority of the conservative majority on the court will be self-described original public meaning originalists who take it to be their mandate to uphold laws that are consistent with that meaning and invalidate laws that are not. So for this reason, if no other, libertarianism is highly politically relevant today. Now, I figure some of you are saying that I've loaded the dice here. You too believe in the Declaration, and you aren't a libertarian. Well, that may be true, but it may not be true. You may call yourself a conservative, but really be a libertarian at heart. After all, self-described libertarians do not agree amongst themselves about everything. There are more moderate and more radical libertarians. But all libertarians agree that governments must respect the rights retained by the people. And libertarians who have thought about it understand that a person's liberty may reasonably be regulated to prevent the violation of other persons' rights. The question is, what else besides what the Declaration instructs do you think government should do? If you think, in addition to securing these rights, government should also mandate moral behavior that does not violate the rights of others, you might be a conservative, or you actually might be a progressive, depending on which morality you think government should impose on the people. If you think that government exists to promote social justice, then you're most likely to be a leftist. In short, contrary to your intuition, libertarianism is a far more modest political theory than most of the other theories on the left or on the right that are far more comprehensive. This is because, in addition to protecting the rights expressed in the Declaration that enable people to pursue the good, they would also use government to compel them to live a particular conception of the good life. That's much more ambitious. And if you're a small d Democrat, the individual must live his or her life according to the will of the majority as expressed by a handful of individuals who are designated legislators. As I explain in my book, Our Republican Constitution, the framers of our Constitution were not Democrats, they were Republicans. They adopted the Constitution precisely because they abhorred what Massachusetts delegate Elbridge Gerry called the excess of democracy. Or, as Gouverneur Morris of Pennsylvania observed, quote, "Every man of observation has seen in the Democratic branches of the state legislatures precipitation, in Congress changeableness, in every department excesses against personal liberty, private property, and personal safety." That sounds pretty libertarian to me. And yet, many conservatives today preach a judicial philosophy in which judges are supposed to defer to the Democratic majority in the legislature in the name of judicial restraint. Chief Justice Roberts justified his swing vote to uphold Obamacare by, quote, "granting the act the full measure of deference owed to federal statutes," unquote. Because it was, in his words, reasonably possible to construe the penalty enforcing the insurance mandate as a tax, he claimed he had a duty to do that. If that decision by John Roberts bothers you, if you think he was not doing his duty as a justice to hold Congress to its enumerated powers, if you think those powers are defined by the original meaning of the text of the Constitution to protect the natural rights of we the people, each and every one of us, and if you think that laws that violate the original meaning, that original meaning, are unconstitutional and invalid, then, to paraphrase Jeff Foxworthy, you just might be a libertarian. And that version of libertarianism is very much politically relevant today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Randy. Our next speaker is Frank Buckley. Mr. Buckley is a foundation professor at George Mason University's Scalia School of Law. His most recent book is titled The Way Back, Restoring the Promise of America. He is a senior editor at the American Spectator, and he has a regular column in the New York Post and has written for many national media outlets. He's also a frequent media guest. He's appeared on programs like Morning Joe, CNN, Rush Limbaugh, NPR, and many others. Please join me in welcoming Frank Buckley.
Thank you very much, and I'm delighted to be here. A correction, The Way Back was 2 books ago. The most recent book is called The Republican Workers' Party, just out, and it's been described as the definitive guide to the 2016 election. And who am I to disagree? I also want to thank Randy Barnett. I confess that I was a little apprehensive about coming here from George Mason. If people know anything about George Mason, he was the guy who refused to sign the Constitution, but Randy reminds us he also had the glorious honor of writing the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which was to a large extent plagiarized by Thomas Jefferson. So Ron Pistrito asks us whether libertarianism is politically relevant, and I confess that had I been asked that in the past, I might have been a little peeved, because I would have remembered how elections where, the Libertarian candidate got 3% of the vote and the Democrat won by 1%, right? Or I might remember how the Libertarian would boast to his liberal friends that really I'm on the same side as you on all the important issues, like same-sex marriage and abortion, and as for my views on Dodd-Frank, we both know they don't matter all that much. And so when I think of all of that, or when I thought of all of that, I would recall those terrible words of Oliver Cromwell: "You have sat here long enough for all the good you have done. Depart, I say, and be done with you. In the name of God, go." But that was then. Because more recently, I've realized how utterly irrelevant politically libertarians are. I realize that as a percent of the electorate, they get about 3%. And they split their vote last time equally between Trump and Hillary. So that's my answer to the question. Politically, libertarianism seems to be utterly devoid of interest. But that's not even true. That's not a complete answer, because it doesn't begin to describe how politicians might be influenced by libertarianism. And there have been these glorious libertarian moments in our politics. I'm thinking particularly of 2012 and the distinction Mitt Romney made between makers and takers, a pure libertarian moment, and also the end of that campaign, as you'll recall. What libertarian has contributed to the Republican Party is largely defeat after defeat after defeat. But in the world of ideas, we also have to recognize the good things that the libertarians have contributed. And in particular, my friend Randy Barnett, we can too easily criticize libertarians if we fail to recognize what they've contributed. If you aren't able to talk intelligently about Henry Manny on insider trading, or Jim Buchanan on public choice, or Bill Niskanen on bureaucracy, or George Stigler on regulation, then the conservative lacks standing to criticize libertarians, and if he tries to do so, misses a good opportunity to remain silent. Before there were libertarians, there were Republicans who wanted marginal tax rates of 91%. And before there was Barry Goldwater, there was Eb Dirksen. So on so many issues, conservatives are on the same side as libertarians. For example, the conservative thinks fears we might have become a class society. And he's right, but the problem is not free markets. The problem is really the absence thereof. It's the liberals who put all the barriers to mobility before us in terrible schools and a decayed rule of law. So I want to say the libertarians saw a portion of the truth, and an important portion of the truth, but only a portion of the truth. And so now let me do that which I'm here for, which is to dump on libertarians. I want to say three things about them. I want to say, first of all, that it's an empirically false theory to the extent that it offers any predictions or statements about the way the world is. Right? If you believe that the best government is the least government, then you're saying you'd like to live in hellholes like Mogadishu. Well, nobody wants that, and of course the libertarian will say, I don't want that either. I want to live in a classically liberal society with the rule of law, but that wouldn't work either, and I'll tell you who realized it wouldn't work, and that was Milton Friedman. Friedman in the 1990s said, look, Soviet Union, here's what you do. It's really simple. You just privatize, privatize, privatize. And then 10 years later, after seeing what happened to Russia, he said, wait a minute, I was wrong. I realized that privatization doesn't mean a thing unless you have the rule of law. Well, here's the problem for the libertarian as opposed to the conservative. Now what we're talking about is what kind of society produces a decent rule of law. And that's the sort of question that conservatives who interest themselves in institutions are better able to answer than the libertarian who just assumes that it's handed to you. Right? It's the conservative who will ask questions like, can you have a decent rule of law absent a virtuous people? Can you have a decent rule of law absent a religious people? Not the libertarian. Now, the libertarian would never ask that one, as Randy noted. So the important question then is how to create a rule of law. And the other thing is this, I guess if there's a prediction in libertarianism, it's that the happiest people will be in the countries that are not least governed or not very governed. So who are the happiest people on earth according to the World Happiness Report? Well, here are the top 5. Finland, Norway, Denmark, Iceland, Switzerland. So not exactly libertarian paradises, are we? I don't say that we're all that free, obviously, but I think we're only number 18. So that's my first problem with libertarianism. Secondly, I think libertarian rests on a very thin or faulty intellectual basis, right? Randy quoted the opening words of Declaration, right, which refer to the self-evident truths of equality and liberty. But note how equality precedes liberty. That is to say, you cannot be a libertarian unless you're an egalitarian. Now that must taste ill in the mouth of the libertarian who prides himself in saying, I don't believe in equality. But it's true, because if you want to say that equality doesn't matter, then you're saying, for example, that the country could be half slave and half free, and that'll work, right? But that doesn't work. Or it might be 95% slave and 5% free, right? And that doesn't work. So the libertarian has to make his peace with egalitarianism. But that's not even the beginning of the problem, because the libertarian also has to explain why it is we are rights-bearing. You people, I think, deserve freedom, only why, right? What is it? Is it that, for example, people have feelings? Well, that kind of gives rise to a sense of empathy for other people, which is a good feeling. But the problem here is that animals have feelings. So if you say it's all a matter of feeling, you're opening the door to Peter Singer, right? If my dog has feelings, it certainly doesn't deserve liberty. And worse still, what would the libertarians say to people who tell us the unborn fetus feels pain? That's got to be a bit of an embarrassment. So if feelings don't suffice, then next, what about our intelligence? Right? That distinguishes us from animals. but it also distinguishes us from each other. So what do we do about the mentally slow, right? Assuming that some people are intelligent and have feelings, I mean, why should I care about them? I mean, it is a fact, of course, that people have feelings, and it is a fact that people are intelligent, more intelligent than animals, but those existential statements about the way the world is don't ground any statements about the way the world should be. That's a famous problem in philosophy. You're smart, and that should matter to me because I don't get it. The libertarian might also say, well, and I think Randy hinted at this, that libertarianism amounts to an efficient insurance contract. That is, I should care about other people because they can put money in my pocket, right? That's the morality of the Clinton Cash Foundation, of course. So, but we're still, think about all the people out there who aren't going to put money in my pocket. I'm referring to the unborn, the dying, the refugee. Most people in the world, I'm not going to cut deals with them. I mean, yes, it does make sense that I treat people with whom I have contracts well, for rational, self-interested reasons. But for most people in the world, they're not going to do anything for me. So why is it the case that the libertarian, I mean, on what basis can he say that we're all equal? And I will answer you, because we're all created in God's image. Even Locke understood that. So that if you recognize the spark in another that links him to God, you're actually practicing your religion as well as following the dictates of your religion. And that's how you get across the is-ought problem, the naturalistic fallacy, as philosophers call it. And finally, I say that libertarianism is morally wanting. Randy says this isn't about morality. I say it has to be. You can't get rid of it, right? The libertarian subscribes to a political philosophy that denies that the state has any responsibility to care for the less well-off, the sick, the orphan. I don't say that means he's morally callous. In fact, most libertarians I know are personally very, very generous. They simply make a distinction between private giving and public giving. They say, I will give, but the state needn't do so, or perhaps better still, shouldn't do so. And the question is whether that distinction can be maintained, and I will argue that it cannot. So if you want to say that, the government should do absolutely nothing, that takes you to Mogadishu, and that's not going to work. Or you can say, well, we have a thin idea of the state. We should, I agree, says the libertarian, have the government pay for aircraft carriers, but not for Social Security or health care. And I don't understand that distinction. I simply don't. I mean, I think the libertarian has to explain why he'd like to support one and not the other, and I'm still waiting for that explanation. The libertarian might also say that if the state refuses to support social welfare, that amounts to a kind of tough love that zeroes out some incredibly wasteful products of the Great Society, things that actually perverted our sense of morality in many ways, things like the AFDC payments. And there's an element of truth in all of that, but it's easy to come up with examples where the poor are not going to be helped if they're simply abandoned to private charity. And I'll give you one example: medical care for the 400,000 odd Americans with severe pre-existing medical conditions, and for them I'd offer a form of national health, but then I'm not a libertarian, right? I'm describing, by the way, something that most Americans, by a great majority, want, and which the libertarian will say, no, no, 1,000 times no. I mean, this is kind of one of the reasons why libertarians in the Republican Party seem to have given it a bit of a death wish. And finally, this is one thing that attracted me greatly to Trump. I'm a nationalist, as Trump is. Libertarians aren't nationalists, of course, and you can see why. If you were a nationalist, you'd have to give up things that libertarians love, like open borders and trade deals that leave Americans worse off. And if you were a nationalist, you'd have to like things that libertarians hate, like generous social welfare program for Americans in need, you'd have to have a sense of fraternity with fellow Americans. And so I say that if the libertarian were a little more American, he might be a little less libertarian. So let me tell you, summing up, the things that the libertarians missed. You can't be a libertarian unless you're an egalitarian. You can't be an egalitarian unless you're a religious believer. And if you're an American nationalist, an egalitarian, and a believer, you'll have to rethink your opposition to all forms of social welfare. But if our libertarian does that, and there's always hope for reclamation of souls, he'll recognize that he's within the mainstream of modern conservatism in the year 2018, and we would welcome him.
Thank you, Frank. Our final speaker on the panel will be Rusty Reno. Rusty is editor of First Things, which is one of America's most influential journals of religion and public life. He was formerly a professor of theology and ethics at Creighton University, and he is the author, most recently, of a book titled Resurrecting the Idea of a Christian Society. He's also published a commentary on the book of Genesis, as well as numerous other books and essays. Please welcome Rusty Reno.
Thank you very much. I lack Randy Barnett's legal precision, and I certainly lack Frank Buckley's wit, but I will give it a shot here on this question about libertarianism and its relevance in 2018. First, let me begin with my definition of libertarianism as a political theory, which I think is quite simple, and part of the attraction of libertarianism is its elegance, is its conceptual elegance. And that's this: a society is more just insofar as its citizens are more free to act and live in accord with their personal preferences. So we have greater justice insofar as we have more freedom to live in accord with our personal preferences. I think it's a very simple definition of justice. And this kind of libertarianism, I think, resonates in America. It taps into our national culture that prizes individual freedom. There's no question about that. Live free or die. Don't tread on me. It has a natural resonance. And libertarianism also upholds the intrinsic value of the individual, something that I think we have moral and religious reasons to want to do, especially in the modern era when the individual can so easily be sort of crushed or controlled by remote and powerful institutions. And so for these reasons, it seems to me, libertarianism will remain a voice of protest on behalf of the individual. And for some, it'll be a vital and cherished voice of protest. But that said, it seems to me that in 2018, libertarianism has largely become irrelevant to the challenges that we face, or in the worst case scenario, actually part of the problems that we face. And let me give three problems, or three senses in which libertarianism is ill-suited. It's ill-suited to the crisis of our time, which is a crisis of loyalty and solidarity, not a crisis of crushing collectivism. To Frank Buckley's notion of fraternity is the crisis, not one of collectivism. Second, libertarianism contributes to the anti-political character of 21st century social imagination, which tends to run in the direction of technocratic wonkery on the one hand, or identity politics and moralism on the other hand. And then finally, the third element, it has the theoretical one-sidedness of libertarianism as a philosophy of freedom, rather than, I would submit, a politics of freedom, which I don't think it provides, that it too easily becomes an enemy of true freedom and limited government. So paradoxically, libertarianism can become an enemy of true freedom and limited government. So I'm going to go through these three things: crisis of solidarity, not collectivism; anti-political in its form; and unable to sustain true freedom. So, crisis of solidarity, not collectivism. Right now, in 2018, the most powerful drivers in the West tend toward the dissolution of traditional communities, including the nation. We see this at work with economic globalization. It's at work in the universalist ideology of human rights, and it's especially the case with mass migration. European politics today suggests that the latter, mass migration, is likely to be the most disruptive force in the 21st century. Now, because libertarianism became to prominence after World War II as an answer to the threats of totalitarianism, it offers no conceptual tools with which even to analyze the political, cultural nature of our actual challenges in the 21st century, because these are all challenges that tend to weaken the state, and for that matter, to weaken not all forms of collective life, rather than to strengthen it. So, libertarianism wants to weaken the state to protect the individual, but the actual era in which we live in, the crisis is the weakening of the state, and that this is going to probably define our politics for the rest of my lifetime. Second element, depoliticized imagination. Politics is an undertaking of the collective we. It's part of the American genius to have made the limits on politics into a supreme and noble act of collective political power. As the great document of limited government begins, the Constitution of the United States, we, the people. In its most extreme forms, libertarianism regards any collective action as an enemy of freedom. And so in that sense, the we is always to be resisted. Now, libertarian has more moderate forms, and in this moderate libertarianism rejects the use of state power to articulate or embody the first person plural, that is to say, the we. I mean, whether it's a moral we, an historical we, any kind of a we, I think even moderate libertarianism wants to reject the use of state power to articulate or embody it. In both cases, libertarianism, like its Enlightenment sibling, communism, urges a utopian anti-politics. Both seek the withering away of the state and the establishment of plenary individual freedom from the coercive power of the we. So for Marx, the end of history would be we'd be free to fish in the morning and read poetry in the afternoon. So we would be free we'd be free from economic necessity as well as being even free from natural necessity. And that's a kind of plenary freedom that I think fits the libertarian definition. A society is more just insofar as its citizens are more free to act and to live in accord with their personal preferences. I think this is a shared vision with Marxism. And in this sense, conservatives are correct when they speak of today's multiculturalism as cultural Marxism. For its logic is anti-traditional. It reflects a desire to break down the power of our inherited accounts of the we. And now, of course, it's easy to think of multiculturalism also as cultural libertarianism. It's very easy to make that flip, to see it as a therapy of critique for young people that frees them from preconceptions about their identity so that they can choose for themselves who they are and what their preferences are. So multiculturalism is a kind of form of anarchism in the kind of classic, early 20th century sense. And transgenderism offers the obvious example of where the Marxist-inspired critiques of traditional categories, sort of Marxist-inspired feminism, dovetails neatly with libertarian aspirations towards a more perfect human freedom, even to the point of deciding one's sex. Now, few of us are Frankfurt School-inspired multiculturalists, or strict libertarians, but I would submit that all of us tend to participate in the anti-politics of these very modern and utopian ways that these utopian ways of thinking encourage. For a variety of reasons, the political culture of the West has become very economistic and utilitarian on the one hand, and very moralistic and absolutist on the other hand. I think immigration is a kind of classic flashpoint for this, where you have economic arguments about immigration and human rights arguments about immigration that tend to dominate the way we talk about it. It's very difficult for us to then formulate a discussion about immigration based on who we are as a nation and what kind of immigration best serves our heritage as an American people. I mean, neither the economic arguments about immigration help us formulate that, nor do the human rights arguments about immigration help us formulate. In fact, they tend to block us from making those kinds of arguments. Neither of these tendencies can articulate a common good. Neither of them can conceptualize the cultural political we that is always the creative subject of political life. Now, libertarianism here tempts us to view our crisis of solidarity, or the diminution of our sense of fraternity. It tempts us to view this as a kind of end of history blessing, freeing us from the constraints of the we so that we can be more free, rather than as a deep threat to the cultural and political achievements of the West. If there is no we, how are we going to sustain the cultural and political achievements of the West? As Samuel Huntington recognized at the end of his life, the most important question we face is a political question. Who are we? Who are we? It's the great question that we face in the 21st century America after a very large wave of immigration beginning in the 1960s. And I believe it's a question that we can answer. We can answer it together successfully, but it's not a question that libertarianism can help us ask. It can't even formulate it for us. Final point about the true nature of freedom and limited government. The systems of checks and balances in our Constitution does far more to limit government power and protect individual freedom than does the Bill of Rights. In much the same way, the deep loyalties that bind citizens together in religious and civic institutions, and most important of all, bind them together in marriage and in stable domestic households. These serve as powerful checks against the tendency of the state to invade and colonize every aspect of modern life. It's the parent's defense of the kitchen table that does much more to preserve freedom from government control than any parchment of rights. The diminution of all these loyalties over the last two generations has atomized our society. As Alexis de Tocqueville recognized, isolated individuals feel vulnerable. Not only are they incapable of resisting state power because of their isolation and vulnerability, but in fact, they will demand the expansion of the state to administer more and more aspects of their increasingly dysfunctional lives. It is not coincidental that the Julia of the 2012 Obama campaign ad was a single woman with a child. She needs the state because she does not have the binding loyalties, religious, civic, and marital. Isolated, atomized individuals are also acutely vulnerable to cultural tyranny. Without shared loyalties that stiffen the spine, and without a solid place to stand to weather the torrents of shame that are heaped upon them, the free individuals championed by libertarians quickly capitulate. It's one of the importances of Hillsdale College, is that it gives young people a place to stand together, which is what we need to do to stand against the cultural tyranny of our time. Now, my libertarian friends see tyranny everywhere, and they are not mistaken. We live in a time of shocking conformism and punitive political correctness. But it's important to recognize that we also live in a time of unprecedented personal freedom. Next to nothing is obligatory in 2018, other than the obligation to refrain from making anything obligatory. Now, this combination of bondage and permission, which I think is our culture today, we have a culture of permission and a culture of bondage, is not a paradox. Freedom begins with the capacity to say no. To say no to worldly powers, to say no to governmental powers, economic powers, and cultural powers. And we can only say no insofar as we are formed in accord with deep shared loyalties. Fraternity is the foundation of freedom. As the founders of our country recognized, a culture of freedom requires solidarity. We either hang together or we hang separately. The struggle for independence is always a political undertaking, and it's a never-ending undertaking, the struggle for independence. We have to continue in that struggle, and it depends upon the strength of the we. Now, libertarianism, like its sibling Marxism, is a universalist ideology, and thus, at the end of the day, is always an enemy of the we, which is necessarily rooted in what is particular and historical. The crisis of the West, I would submit, which we are in the midst of, stems from the loss of the we. That loss is eroding our political capacity to transmit and protect our cultural inheritance, which is one of freedom. So, I want to conclude here with libertarians like to be very logical, and which I always admire. It's one of the attractions of libertarianism. It's very rigorous conceptually. So I'm going to end with a syllogism to encapsulate the failure of libertarianism. So it's a syllogism, if you'll forgive me. First premise: democracy requires civic friendship or solidarity. It requires fraternity. Civic friendship, second premise, civic friendship or solidarity requires a modicum of unity in shared loves. Third premise, libertarianism refrains from promoting shared loves. In its more extreme form, it treats shared loves as threats to freedom. Conclusion, therefore, libertarianism undermines the conditions for sustaining our democratic culture. Thank you.
So I've been trying to figure out a takeaway from the panel thus far. Professor Barnett tells us that our founding fathers were libertarians and that we who love the founding are also all libertarians. Our other panelists have suggested that libertarianism is akin to Marxism, transgenderism, and that libertarians seem to take delight in wanting to throw the sickest Americans out on the street. What are we to make of this? I thought before we went to audience questions that I would give the panelists just at least a minute or two to offer some additional remarks, and maybe we'll start with Randy.
Thank you. Well, I have way more that I could say or would like to say than I would have time in a minute or two, and I would begin with all the things that I agreed with that Frank and Rusty said. I agree, I would say, with really most of what Rusty said and a lot of what Frank said, and that would take a long time to explain why I agree with that thing. But so what can I say in a minute or two that would be at all responsive, given all that? I think a couple things. First, what you didn't hear from them is how government is supposed to provide the ends that they think we need, that I agree with them that we need. You didn't hear from them an explanation of how a government that's powerful enough to provide the sort of moral vision that they have in mind is not also powerful enough to provide an opposite moral vision that they would find abhorrent. There's got to be an answer to that. You can't just hypothesize a mythical government that's going to give you all the right answers. That would make government into a god. And that's something that we as Americans try not to do. And so we didn't hear anything about that. There's just this magic government solution to provide these things that we all agree a good society needs. So I'd have to, there's just that's missing. Now, morality used to be, and religious morality in particular, used to be comprehensive. It used to be a comprehensive theory that required government involvement in order to make a good society. This is what religious establishments were. If in fact, in order to live a good life, you have to not only be good yourself, but you have to be in a community where everybody else is doing the right thing and living the right way, then you have to have an established religion to ensure that everybody is living the right way. And of course, we know what happened as a result of that. We had the persecution of heretics. We had religious wars in which millions of people were killed. And eventually we had to put a stop to that. And Locke wrote his theory of toleration on the ground, making the argument that what we need to do is we need to decentralize the decision-making out of what religion we have to the level of conscience because of a right of conscience, and each person gets to decide what religion they have. It's a decentralization of the most ultimately important decision that anyone has to make. And it meant that religion itself had to change in order to be consistent with the notion of religious toleration. That was a very, very important move. And then Locke, in his letters on toleration, backs that up. He says, in order for that to work, then each person has to have a kind of moral jurisdiction over things like property and other sort of thing. In other words, property rights in Locke's letters on toleration were subordinate to the need for religious diversity, which meant moral diversity, because the alternative was a Hobbesian war of all against all. We haven't gotten an answer from either of the other two eloquent speakers as to how the war of all, the Hobbesian political war of all against all can be avoided if you try for what's sometimes called a corner solution to impose your preferred moral outcomes on everybody, because they are in fact obviously the right outcomes. In fact, what Locke, I think, showed is that liberty, or decentralization down to the level of our individual rights, which are bounded, not unlimited, but bounded, liberty decentralized down to that level is everybody's second best solution. First best solution is get morality right, the way you think it's right. But then that risks having someone else's morality imposed upon you, which is terribly wrong. So second best solution is we decentralize to the extent possible down to the level of individuals. Now, again, in the interest of time, let me just say something in response to Frank. That's sort of more or less in response to Rusty, and both. But in response to Frank, Frank says that libertarians need to explain. First of all, libertarians need to believe in equality. Well, libertarians do believe in equality. That's not a problem. Herbert Spencer, a famous libertarian in the 19th century, defined libertarianism in terms of the law of equal freedom. That's what he called it. Equality was at the heart of the concept of libertarianism. But as for libertarians have an obligation to explain why we have certain rights, I totally agree with him. And Frank has written a lot of books, which I admit I haven't read, except for one, because he visited my seminar, Recent Books on the Constitution, and gave one of his books. Well, I wrote a book, which he obviously hasn't read, called The Structure of Liberty, Justice and Rule of Law, because I agreed with him. I think it was incumbent to explain why we have certain rights, and I wrote a whole book to explain it. I don't blame him for not reading it. On the other hand, my defense to the answer to the question of why is read my book, and you'll see my answer. And the answer is this. The simple answer is this. Natural rights are the necessary prerequisite for individuals to pursue the good life, not to maximize their individual private preferences the way Rusty has characterized it, but to pursue the good life while living in proximity with other individuals who themselves have those rights and whose actions can adversely affect each other. Natural rights are a solution, a social solution to a social problem. And it's a claim, an empirical claim, that societies who respect those rights do better than societies who don't. And the other thesis of my book, and now I'll close because I know RJ is getting antsy, is that the rule of law is essential to the pursuit of justice. Justice is defined by rights, but the rule of law is the way we instantiate justice, and that's why the title of my book is The Structure of Liberty, Justice, and the Rule of Law, because libertarians in my experience, have given too little thought about the relationship between the rule of law and justice, and that's what my book attempts to do.
So who does read these books? That's what I would like to know.
Well, if he hasn't read my book, the hell with him. Look, much of what Rusty has said comes down to a slippery slope argument. I'm not going to bother trying to respond to that, except to say that if it were the case that signing on to what he sees as a libertarian constitution would make us free, then he has to explain why on measures of freedom we seem to be dropping like a stone, and why so many other countries are more free than we are, with very different non-libertarian constitutions. But I don't want to get into that. I want to do two little things. I talked about nationalism, and I want to connect it with the idea of freedom. I want to say that there's something very distinctive about American nationalism. That is, what makes you American, importantly, is your allegiance to the icons of one's American identity, which is the Declaration and the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, speeches by Abraham Lincoln, so that if you are American, you are, in that sense, necessarily liberal in the good old-fashioned sense of that word, and that if you're illiberal, then you're somewhat less than American. But to pursue that, I want to add that people will sometimes say about that kind of thing, well, that's called creedal nationalism. That's just signing on to a belief structure, and being American is more than that, right? There's an American culture, and I want to say, yes, that's quite true. There is an American culture. It's about the things that we all enjoy, right? The things we all share, you know, apple pie, baseball, jazz, country and western, Aretha Franklin. And so if one is a white nationalist, one is not an American. We're too diverse for any of that. If you don't like Johnny Cash, I'm afraid I don't regard you as a real American, okay? Or you could be a little bit better. Therefore, there is something noble about American nationalism in that it is, I think, both necessarily liberal in that good old-fashioned sense, and also generous with respect to the immense diversity of who we are as Americans. I don't have problems with that we question. I kind of know who we are.
This always comes up when I make presentations. Well, what if the people who control the government have a different view or a different moral, cultural view than I do? And I just think that politics is the making of laws to define, defend, and transmit a way of life. That is the definition of politics. And we're always tempted, I think, to try to come up with a form of politics that deliver us from the perils of politics, right? Because it's an ongoing argument about what our way of life is, and we feel the agony of that argument is hard to endure. And modernity has been characterized by various efforts to escape from politics. That's my sense of anti-politics. Marxists have a theory of history that tells them where we are going, you know, and so it delivers them from the need to engage in political deliberation because they have a scientific theory about history. And libertarianism in its strict forms and other forms of liberalism in overly theorized forms of liberalism also do the same thing. So how can we design our societies such that we don't have to deliberate about what our way of life is? And so I think that that's one of the temptations we all face, is the temptation to try to escape from that process of deliberation.
Thank you. I think we're going to get some questions from the audience, and there are students here with microphones, so just wait till you're approached.
Yes, sir.
Please,
Is
would
this
you stand
functional?
up?
Yep.
Thank you.
Stand up? Fine, thank you. I'm listening to the panelists with rapt attention. I'm trying to summarize in my own mind, is it fair to say, if we float in the logic, use that as a basis, say that libertarianism is a necessary but insufficient basis for the good citizen?
I agree
I
with
would
that.
say a love of liberty is a necessary, but libertarianism, no, that takes a proper love of liberty and turns it into the central rather than, which in our time, I just don't think that that's the great issue that we face. The fact is our country's, our country's less imperiled than the European countries are, but they're dissolving. And that's not, as I say, it's a crisis of solidarity and fraternity, not a crisis of freedom.
I agree with what this questioner said. That's the reason why I insisted that libertarianism was a political theory. It's not a moral theory. It presupposes some moral theories, perhaps, but it's not one, which means it's not enough. It's necessary. Natural rights are necessary, but by no means sufficient to ensure either a good citizen or a good society. And that's my position.
Over here.
Mr. Buckley, if there is broad agreement as to the nature of rights between conservatives and libertarians, why do we need to get into the issue of whether or not they come from God, or get into the more philosophical deity issues? Just be happy and be content with the agreement as to the nature of what works, capitalism, limited government, private property, etc., and leave it at that.
Well, what I said is, what I questioned is, why is it you have rights? Look, I don't know you. I mean, you seem like a nice fellow. You're here with the Hillsdale crowd, which speaks very well of you. But nevertheless, the real question here is, what does this natural right rest on? I mean, we've heard a lot about it, and I'm saying, where the heck did that come from? Because it seems to me that it needs some kind of support. And it won't come from some statement of fact about who we are and we're intelligent and we have feelings and all of that. I will tell you, I had this experience when I was in school in grade 1. The teachers brought to class a severely deformed child, hydrocephalic child. The parents of the child must have thought that the experience would be good for him, and from the way he smiled, I think that was correct. Our teachers, Sisters of Charity, must have thought the experience would be good for us, the students. And it is not a month has passed since then, but I've remembered his face, yet counted ashamed that I can't remember his name. From them, from him and from the good sisters, I learned something about equality. I learned that if you start with the idea that we all have souls, you rest your belief in rights on a much more firm foundation. I'll add one last thing. In all my years in school, I don't think from the sisters I once heard the word rights. Duty, yeah.
Thank you for everything you've said so far. I'd like to hear mostly from Mr. Buckley, but anyone could comment on this. I'd like to make some statements.
I think you will whether you want to or not.
I would like to make some statements on the beliefs of libertarianism relevant to egalitarianism, then hear your thoughts. Assuming libertarianism accepts Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand, if most or all individuals provide some benefit, not necessarily financial or monetary, to another individual, and if human society is relatively globalized, then it would be the case that it is in the interest of the individual to protect the same natural rights of all humans, because most, if not all, will contribute to the benefit of most, if not all, humans. Whether one individual provides a net benefit to another individual would need to be calculated on a case-by-case basis and determined subjectively by the individual, as Carl Menger discovered. as Karl Menger discovered. Lastly, important influencers of libertarianism like Friedrich Hayek advocated for social safety nets, which would encourage libertarians to provide for the worst off in society. Thank you.
No, I'm not sure I got it. I'm not sure I got it.
You're not sure you got the question, so.
Can you restate that very concisely?
Yes. Did you understand that? In a sentence.
It sounded like, and I might have misinterpreted, that you were saying that an issue with libertarians is that they are not egalitarian enough, that they would encourage slavery in certain circumstances.
That they're not egalitarian.
So, but if they accept Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand, that all men can contribute to the benefit of all other men, then it would be in the libertarians' interest to protect all rights of all men.
Okay.
Do you disagree with that?
We got it, I think. Thanks.
There was a guy called George Fitzhugh who wrote a book called Sociology of the South. He was defending slavery. The book was the book which no book more infuriated Lincoln than that book. And in the book, Fitzhugh said, look, slavery is really a benign institution, and if you are a real philanthropist, then you'll acquire slaves. And moreover, only 5% of Americans are the members of the culture-bearing elite who deserve freedom. So, you know, the prior question here is, why is it that each person, including that hydrocephalic child I referred to a moment ago, why is it they're entitled to dignity of some kind or other? You see, I don't see that as an empirical matter. I mean, when Jefferson said all men are created equal, was that an empirical statement? Did that rest on some basis of fact? No, it rested on something very, very different. And unless you go back beyond liberty to that which makes us all equal, then you're spinning your wheels.
Okay. Randy?
Yeah, Fitzhugh argued that slavery was morally superior system to wage capitalism, wage slavery, he called capitalism. Why? Because under capitalism, capitalists owed no duty to the weak, they owed no duty to the infirm, to the young, or to the old, unlike slaveholders who actually maintained the well-being of their slaves from cradle to grave, making slavery a superior moral system. That actually sounds a lot like some of the arguments I heard on behalf of a so-called conservative. I don't know that I believe it's a conservative vision of what the government should be doing. Only instead of talking about chattel slavery of African Americans, we're talking about essentially enslaving, to use Fitzhugh's term, a whole people in order to care for us from cradle to grave. That was Fitzhugh's argument. And it seems to me that's an argument that has been adopted rather than rejected by at least some of what I've heard this morning from Frank.
I am afraid that's all we have time for. Our next panel convenes at 10:30, and I look forward to seeing you all back for it. Thank you very much.